My name is Tim Webster. I've been attending Riverwood for 27 years, and I'm usually at the Factory 11:15 service if I'm not service directing. One of the mind monsters that suddenly appeared in my life was loneliness. Not just loneliness, but it was a fear of dying alone. And I didn't even know I had it until it manifested in my life very, very abruptly and painfully. So during the pandemic, I eventually caught COVID. I think everybody did. And my wife had already left me the year before. And when I got sick, my son got a little scared as well, and he moved out. So it was just me by myself, rambling around my house, cats, and this fear that manifested almost like it was a physical presence in my house. And it was almost like it sat across from me on the couch, and I had to look it in the eye every night. During the day, it wasn't so bad, but at night, the sun would go down, and I would wrestle with this, and I realized I was terrified of dying lonely, unwanted, unloved, unmourned. What happened, a friend of mine that I met at church 35 years ago knew what I was going through. I'd been talking with him about my marital struggles, and he was a good support, saw what I was going through, and lived in my neighborhood, dropped off a jar of chicken soup. And that was the turning point. The truth arrived in the shape of a jar of chicken soup. It was a tangible reminder that somebody cared about me. Somebody loved me enough to make chicken soup for me. And I knew that he'd done it because he was a man of faith and kindness and concern. And that was the truth. And once I had that truth, I remember that fear evaporating because it was based on the lie that I was unworthy and unloved and unwanted. And I had a tangible reminder in front of me that that wasn't true. And once I was able to hang on to that truth became real, and I believed it. The lie evaporated and the fear was gone. Eventually I got better. My son moved back, and I remember turning around and saying, I'm not going to die lonely. And I realized after that experience that being alone is just a circumstance. Sometimes you find yourself alone in the car or alone in your house, and those are okay. That's an unavoidable circumstance. But I've come to believe that loneliness is a choice. It's about recognizing whether or not you are connected. And I heard a great expression the other day: our feelings are great consultants, but they're terrible CEOs. So you might feel lonely, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you are. If you've got a fear, face it. It's 10 times bigger when you try to avoid it or pretend it's not there. But when you turn around and face it, God's Spirit is there with you to show you its true size, and it's minimal. Fear can't kill you. It makes you think it can, but it can't.
Thanks, Tim, for sharing that story with us. I want to take this morning to welcome you and say good morning, and it's really good to see your faces. For those that are joining us at the fire hall and online, we welcome you as well. Now, often, I look at my kids who are not even teens and wish to some extent that they would have had the freedoms I had growing up. I wonder as a parent how I have so much fear and concern for their safety. What happened? You know, today, I am more aware, I guess, of the evils that could harm my kids. I'm aware of negative peer pressure. I'm aware of bullying. I'm aware of exposure to ideologies and content via social media that could be harmful. I'm aware of, stranger danger. I'm aware of kidnapping of kids. I'm aware of child trafficking. And the list goes on. But as a kid, I remember literally leaving my house early in the morning, especially if it's Saturday, after I finished chores, and I would meet up with some of my friends, and we would roam the neighborhood like we owned it. And then at times, we would actually go to other neighborhoods and check out what's happening. We had so much adventures, cycling, wrestling in backyard. Sometimes we didn't even know whose backyard it was. We just had a mud pit, and we would just go there and wrestle. We love making jokes. And when we had some extra cash, we would find a Chinese restaurant and eat some Chinese fried rice. You know, everyone in my neighborhood looked out for each other. And never once did I sense fear, except for this one dog that lives in our neighborhood. This dog had the habit of ambushing me and my sister from time to time as we make our way from the bus to our home after school. Now, after school, I have to tell you the truth, I would often feel anxious. It was not guaranteed that this dog would attack us, but knowing that he's around would make me carry within my body a sense of uneasiness. I would be anxious. Now, when the school bell rang, I began to worry. My mind goes into overdrive, looking at all the spots I believe that this dog would be hiding. My mind would begin to think about ways that I can escape if he chases me, or if I need to sacrifice myself, because usually my little sister Angelina would be accompanying me. Most often, we would get to our house with no issue. However, there are those few times when we would hear a bark, roof, roof. And biologically, the amygdala, Pastor Todd talks about this when he teaches on anxiety, the lizard brain or the chicken brain fires up, shutting down the part of the brain responsible for reasoning and judgment. My heart rate increases. My blood began to flow away from my heart, and my senses become heightened. My blood began to flow towards my limbs, allowing me to flee for my life, often screaming. Of course, the same thing is happening to my sister. However, just a little bit faster, because she's always ahead of me. Now, if you are here today, welcome to week 4 of our series called Mind Monsters. In week 1, we shared the importance and the impact of our thoughts. Week 2, we talked about anxiety. Week 3, worry. And today, we'll be talking about fear. Now, although fear, anxiety, and worry can be intertwined, there are marked differences between the three. You see, anxiety is this sustained state of unease about future or unclear threats. That's me constantly feeling uneasy about encountering this dog, even when he wasn't present. Worry is a thought-based preoccupation with potential problems, often less emotionally charged, but mentally exhausting when excessive. That's me repeatedly thinking about how to avoid the dog and replaying scenarios in my mind on how to actually avoid the attack. And then there is fear. Fear is often instinctive and survival-based. Fear is an intense, immediate response to a real and present danger. I hear the dog barking, I turn around and I see him charging towards me, and immediately I took off for my life. But how does fear work? Well, when the amygdala, the lizard brain, is fired up, it gives 2 more options in addition to flight. We can also fight or freeze. You see, the fight and flight has the same biological occurrences of our heart rate increasing and blood flowing to our limbs, allowing us to react to danger. But the freeze mode has a different mechanism. Our heart rate decreases instead of increases, and we become immobile. Freeze mode can have a protective function. In the natural world, it's why animals play dead while on the threat, right? Like the dead possum. But the problem with fear is this. The tactic of fight, flight, or freeze may be great when we are in immediate danger. But most of our lives, we are not looking down a barrel gun, or are we being chased by dogs? Yet, we live in a world that is in constant fear. You know, author and speaker Joanna Hayat states, fear surrounds us. She said, we live in a world grappled with a fear dilemma, one that's amplified by the constant stream of information we consume daily on many different platforms. Platforms such as social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitter X, TikTok, the news networks such as CNN, BBC, Fox News, podcasts and apps all contribute to this fear dilemma. These platforms make it easy for us to access stories about global suffering, economic instability, community tensions, job insecurity, and countless other concerns. Whether it's sensationalized headlines, fear-induced videos, or viral misinformation, these medium brings the world's anxiety right to our fingertips, feeding a culture of fear. In 2020, SafeHome.org conducted an online poll of about 2,634 adults living in the U.S. about the degrees to which they felt fear in different scenarios. And this is what they found. Their fears were ranked by two metrics: the percentage of respondents who were afraid or very afraid of each scenario, and by a fear score. The fear score was weighed by very afraid, it was given 3, afraid was given 2, slightly afraid was given 1, and no fear was given 0. They only included fear scores, very afraid again, and afraid. And they found that the top 5 fear was this: loved ones dying. Second, loved ones becoming seriously ill. Third, personally becoming seriously ill. Fourth, not having enough money for retirement. And fifth, mass shooting and gun violence. Now, when we look at these top 5 fears in context of the environment, we can understand why. See, in 2020, the world was dealing with COVID-19. People were losing loved ones. People were becoming ill. Hospitals were at capacity. People were quarantined. Business were shutting down. Workers were prevented from going to work. Some industries began to make cuts. There was also an escalation of violence as law enforcement in the U.S. came under scrutiny after several shootings. Our world was in a boiling pot of fear. But what does this tell us? That fear is often enhanced by our environments. And this morning, I want us to look at 4 external factors that enhances fear by looking at the story of a very familiar, fear-acquainted guy called Gideon. And the first factor that we see that enhances fear in Gideon's story is called struggle. We're going to read from Judges 6:11, and this is what it says. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. You see, God had chosen, give you some backstory to this, God had chosen Israel as his own possession. He loved Israel. He saved them from the hands of the Egyptians. He set them in a land that was prosperous. He made several binding agreements with them to be their God and for them to be his people, in which they all agreed. God remained faithful towards Israel, but Israel sought to replace God. And as a result, God handed them over to their enemies, and an enemy that's called the Midianites, who repeatedly invaded Israel. They destroyed their crops, they stole their livestock, and leave the land barren. Now, their overwhelming numbers and constant raid left Israel impoverished and desperate. And all of a sudden, they began to remember this God. And they began to cry out to God for help. Now, when the angel showed up, Gideon was hiding in a cave beating wheat. He was in survival mode. And fear made the decision to hide in a cave so that he would have bread to eat. But it wasn't only him. We were told in Judges 6:2, it says, and the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. And because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. They were surrounded by struggle. This has been going on for over 7 years. You see, struggle can often put limits on our thinking and creativity and our ability to actually have a solution. Gideon, when he began to think of bread, when his stomach, began to grow and he started thinking of bread, he thinks about the Midianites. The thought of the Midianites brought fear, and the fear said to him, hide. And when we hide, I should say, and not face fears, it can become debilitating. It becomes so big that the thought of facing it can feel hopeless and helpless. Gideon could not see a solution forward in the midst of struggle. The second factor that enhances fear is attention. We read in Judges 6:12-15, it says this. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, an angel appeared to him, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all these happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our father recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and has given us into the hands of the Midian. And the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? And he said to him, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. If we had asked Gideon why this was happening, he would have said, God has abandoned his people. God is not with us. God doesn't care for us. God is absent. And he had no hope as a result. But God shows up and says to Gideon, I'm right here. In fact, I'm going to use you to solve the problem, to deal with the root cause of fear, the Midianites. God called Gideon to take some responsibility, to get into the game, to play a role, to do something. You see, if I took my finger, and let's say, what if I took my finger and I said, I would like someone here this morning to come up here with me and share a little bit about their story with us. Do you feel it? Do you feel it? Right? For some of you, your eyes are looking down. You're trying not to make eye contact. Right? For some of you, say, if this gets uncomfortable, if he points to me, I'm walking out this door. Right? You see, God pointed a finger at Gideon. And Gideon responded, please, Lord, how can I? How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my father's house. You've got the wrong person. He wanted the freedom, but he also wanted comfort. You see, attention often enhances our fear. You see, the third factor that enhances fear is uncertainty. You see, although he heard the words of the angel, he was uncertain of how God could use him to defeat the Midianites. And we read in Judges 6 that he asked for a sign to ensure he was hearing the angel correctly. It's like, I heard you, but you need to do a little bit more for me to kind of hear you. And so Gideon quickly prepared the kind of soup I would love to eat, goat and some fufu. But the Bible actually said cakes without yeast. And the angel touched the food with a staff, and fire sprang up and consumed the meat and cakes. The uncertainty of how he was going to become Israel's deliverer weighed heavy on him. He was carrying within himself the fear of uncertainty. So he asked God for signs. Now, this would not be the first and last sign that God would have to give him because of his the fear of uncertainty. But we read in Judges 6:36, Gideon, still uncertain, began to test God with a fleece. He said, God, can you make this fleece wet while the ground remains dry? And God did that. And when God did that, he went back and said, okay, listen, don't get angry with me. He tests God a second time and he says, can you make the fleece dry while the ground is wet? And God answered his request. And then again, there was before facing the Midianites, Gideon also felt fearful in Judges 7:9 and 15. And God instructed him, he sensed his fear, and God instructed him to spy on the enemy's camp so that he can overhear what the soldiers were saying. And when Gideon went and spied, he heard one of the soldiers talking about a dream in which symbolized Gideon's victory. This assurance gave him the confidence to move forward. You see, when Gideon was uncertain again, he felt fear. And the fourth and final factor that enhances fear is change. Change. Again, in Judges 6:25 to 27, God asked Gideon to take a step, to grab 2 bulls and destroy the altar of Baal and build the altar of God. And now, that was a big ask, right? For a guy who was busy in a cave beating wheat to get some bread. To go and destroy what people were now accepting as their source of strength, their God, this idol called Baal. Gideon, gripped with fear, grabbed some men, and when the sun set, did a drive-by at night. to do something that can bring change can cause fear. See, fears were enhanced in struggle, in attention, in uncertainty, and in change. Yet these very things that enhances fears also called Gideon out of his comfort zone into a new experience of faith. Now, we live in a world that is very acquainted with fear. And there are many people in our world today that has a lot to say about how to deal with fear. For example, Trevor Reagan, an avid podcaster, he says this: we're all biological creatures and we can't get rid of fear. We can't go into our brains and take out our lizard brain. He says, instead of that, we need to learn to keep fear in the back seat. We can kick it out, but we can't give it the wheel. He went on to say, we need to develop the skill to feel fear and ask questions. When we feel fear, just volunteer, just get up and just do something. When we feel fear, we have to learn to step out our comfort zone. Olympia Lee Point, an award-winning rocket scientist, she's known as the new Einstein. She said there's 3 things we need to do to deal with fear. Once we feel it, name it and reject it. She said you need to reprogram your brain with different thoughts. And thirdly, she said, rebuild your neurons in the brain by taking action. That when we take action, even if we are, like, for example, afraid of our financial situation, just take an action. Just do something small, like clean the house. All of a sudden, your brain is going to build new neurons, and something else is going to kick in besides fear. So rebuild your neurons in the brain by taking action. And then there's Ruth Soukup. She's a researcher and an author of fear. You know, fear shows up, she says, in everyone differently. And we all have a fear fingerprint that can be identified in one or several of 7 distinct patterns. And she lists the 7 patterns. The first is the procrastinator. Is a perfectionist, spends a lot of time getting organized and afraid to make the wrong decisions. And then there's the people pleaser. The fear of being judged or letting people down. Care a lot about what people think. And then there's the rule follower. A proven path to be followed. Fear exploring the unknown. And then there's the outcast. On the surface, they look like they don't care, but they do. And have a tendency to push people away because they fear rejection. And then there's the self-doubter. Deep down, the fear that they are not enough. They're usually very critical of themselves. And then there's the excuse maker, very smart, but struggles to share opinions and afraid of being blamed or held accountable if something goes wrong. And finally, there's the pessimist. Pain and trauma is what holds the pessimist back and wouldn't do anything because they're afraid of being hurt. Every opportunity feels like a risk of being hurt again. You see, Ruth argues this point. She said, this all happens under the surface. And when we identify how our fears are showing up, then we can do something about it. Now, all of these methods all have the same thing in common. It puts control of handling fear in your hands. You need to embrace it. You need to reject it. You need to identify it. But how does God desire us to deal with fear? As we look at Gideon's story. You see, when Gideon experienced struggle, attention, uncertainty, and change, it erupted in him real fear, tangible fear. But instead of letting it win, he learned to approach God in the midst of his fear. And what he experienced of God, and what we can see of God is this. 1, God is with us, even in our fears. Gideon learned that God sees potential in him, even when he feels inadequate. When the angel called Gideon a mighty warrior, Gideon was hiding in fear. He protests that he is the weakest in his family and clan, but God reassures him, Gideon, I will be with you. God's presence is more important than our own strength or qualification. God is saying, look at me. Secondly, God is patient and willing to strengthen our faith. Gideon learns that God is patient with doubt. Gideon repeatedly asks for signs, such as the fleece being wet and dry, and God graciously answers each request to strengthen his faith. God understands our uncertainty and provides reassurance when needed. 3, God calls us to trust him, not ourselves, but to trust him. When God reduces Gideon, there was a time that God reduces Gideon's army from 32,000 capable men to just 300. Gideon learns to rely on God rather than numbers or human strength. The victory over the Midianites is a demonstration of God's power, not Gideon. Victory over fear comes through faith and reliance on God, not human effort. 4thly, God is faithful to deliver. Gideon learns that God will keep his promises. Despite overwhelming odds, God delivers Israel out of the hands of the Midianites using unconventional tactics. Instead of sword that everybody uses, instead of shields that everybody uses, instead of horses and chariots that everybody uses, God used torches, jars, and shouts. God's ways are often unexpected, but they are always effective. And 5th and final, God alone deserves worship and glory. After Israel defeated the Midianites, the men of Israel came to Gideon and said, Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of the Midianites. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. He knew the reason the Midianites oppressed them. The reason why fear had come into their lives and crippled him and crippled Israel as a nation was because they were worshiping an idol. They forgot God. They replaced him with statues. And that's why fear came into their lives. He learned that when we look to God, God receives the worship and we receive strength. We receive peace. You know, when I think of this story, I think of this scripture that is in John 6:16-21. And it talks about the disciples being on water. And they were caught in a storm. And as they were in the storm, they began to row very hard. The Bible says they rowed for about 3 to 4 miles. And they were exhausted. They were tired. They felt like this storm is going to take them down. They were fearful. And all of a sudden, they saw an image of a man walking on the water. And when they saw that, their fear went from one level to another. It increased dramatically. And then what they heard was a voice saying, do not fear, for it is I. Do not fear, for it is I. God is saying what you need when you fear is me. Just look to me. Just look to me. And the Bible continues to say that when they saw Jesus, all of a sudden they grabbed his hands and they gladly took him into the boat. And when they took him into the boat, the waters died down. The wind and the storm stopped. You know, many years ago, many years ago, I decided to leave Canada and go live with my wife in Kenya. And when I got there, I lived in my father-in-law's house. He was like, Dunstan, you're welcome. Welcome home, son. He was just happy to see me. And I was like, one day, as I was walking in their garden, they have a beautiful garden, and I was walking, it just hit me. This fear just hit me. Like, I'm not good enough. Like a fear that my situation will never change. That the struggles that I've faced will always be there. And I began to cry out to God. I was like, God, help me. I began to weep and weep and weep. And I went to bed weeping. But I made sure I didn't waste my tears. You know, I was like, God, I'm weeping to you. I'm not weeping to any. I'm just see my tears. Like it was a conversation. You know, like just see my tears. This is me weeping. Like this is my situation. That night, God gave me a dream. And in the dream, I was taken out of my bed And I was like lifted, airlifted. And there was a being next to me that was just bright. And it took me over this house. And when I looked at the house, I was able to see inside the house clearly. It's like the roof and everything just moved. And I saw a guy, and this guy had glasses. And he was lying on the bed. And he was reading. He was looking so studious. You know, man, when you look at this guy, I was like, man, this dude has everything together. And I was like, wow. I just began to wish that I could be like this guy. And then all of a sudden, it was like this thing just came over my eyes. And I was able to see who this person is. And that was actually me. And I got excited. I was like, oh my goodness. I got so excited. And then I saw Jessica. And Jessica was doing something that I've never seen Jessica done. Still haven't seen her done it today. She was actually jumping on the bed. Like my son, like a 2-year-old. And she was so happy. And I'm like, is that, did I remarry or something? I was like, what's going on here? Is that, and God opened, that's your Jessica. And I was like, oh my God. And then all of a sudden, I was given insight that this house was my house. And then I heard the voices of children. And I guess I was so excited that I moved in the dream like towards the door to open it. And when I opened it, a white light just shined in my face. And then I woke up. I'm sharing that with you because like our fears may show up in different ways. You know the things you fear about that grips you. But when we hand it over to God, like He's able to speak to us in such unique ways. Church, I want to challenge you this morning. Don't just keep it in. And especially the men. We have a way in just keeping it in. I want to encourage you to talk to God about it. To weep in front of God, even if you need to, about it. Because this God has the ability to step into our boat and calm our fears. If you're able, let's rise and worship Him.